Welcome everyone. We're still admitting a few more people, but I think we're good to go. Welcome everyone on this lovely warm Tuesday afternoon. I hope you're all well hydrated and ready for what we hope will be a really interesting seminar. My name's Sarah Cooney. I'm one of the regional managers with the Lloyds Bank Foundation. I'm the regional manager for parts of London and for Surrey. I'd like to introduce my colleagues as well, who are also supporting and taking part in the seminar, in this webinar even. So my colleague Claire Rance, who's the regional manager for the Southwest, Marie Hale, who's quietly behind in the background, as is my colleague Colm, who is running the tech today, for which we're very grateful, especially since leaving me in charge of the tech might make for a very short webinar. We are recording this. We are recording this seminar, the presentation parts of this webinar, to make them available afterwards. If that's an issue for you, please let us know. Please turn off your camera. As I said, at the end we're going to be having some questions and answers, and that will not be recorded. And welcome to, this is the second of our two webinars on recruitment and retention. We had a webinar which I think some of the people here today also attended last week, on focusing on recruitment. And this, as I said, is about retention and promoting an environment that retains staff. The reason we came forward to present these two webinars is that we've seen both been hearing through our conversations with you, our charity partners, and also through the reports that you submit to us, that both staff recruitment and staff retention have become a huge challenge at present, and it's one we ourselves have experienced. So it is very much sector-wide, and in other sectors also. So this session is going to focus on staff retention. It's a big issue, it's a big challenge, and we're not going to be able to solve it in an hour, but hopefully you'll be able to leave the session with some useful ideas, tools and resources, and potentially steps you can think about in terms of your own organisation and practice. In terms of the format for the session, we will be hearing first from our two guest speakers, Alison Smith, the Chief Executive of Roots HR, which is also one of our enhanced partners and provides organisational development support to our charity partners, and Niamh Eastwood, the Executive Director of Release, who is one of our charity partners, who's going to be talking about their particular experiences and the journey that they're on in terms of thinking about how they support and retain their staff as well. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So I said at the start, please do feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, but also if you have questions, if you're happy to share them, please introduce them, please include them in the chat for everyone, or if you'd like to submit them more anonymously, please do a direct message via the chat to my colleague Claire Rance. Hoping that all makes sense. The other side of the chat, use of the chat, we really like you to make use of, apologies, that didn't make sense, is you are all very experienced. You all have experience in this area, and we'd really welcome what your hints and tips are, or where you've seen successful approaches to staff retention. And so please, if you have something that you'd like to share in the chat, we'd really welcome that information as well, so that we can, really support peer learning and peer support here. So as I mentioned, we are recording the two presentations, and with no further ado, I would like to introduce again Alison Smith, who's the CEO of Roots HR CIC, and also one of our enhanced partners, who will be talking to us about staff retention. Alison.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very, very much. And first of all, I'm going to apologise to people if my voice is a little strange. I'm just at the end of a viral infection. So if I need to cough, I may just mute myself as we go through this. But yeah, so I'm, as Sarah said, Alison Smith, CEO and lead consultant at Roots HR CIC. We're a community interest company, so we're a social enterprise, and we're a specialist consultancy that provides human resources services for social sector employers. And we've been going since 2009. And we are a provider on the Lloyds Bank Foundation Enhanced programme. So there may be some charity partners here today that we have worked with in the past, or perhaps are currently working with, or may work with in future. So it's great to be here. I'm going to use the old next slide please phrase for Callum, because he's driving the slides behind the scenes for us. So what we're going to talk about today is just very briefly, what do we mean by employee retention? And really think about, what are the key things? Why do people typically leave a job? And obviously factoring that into the current sort of employment market as we see that at the moment. And then we'll be looking at some tips for employee retention strategy for small charities, and just go through some of the various aspects of and tips for those. And as Sarah said, you know, please do share any of your own tips in the chat as we go through, because it's about sort of peer learning and sharing that knowledge and information as well. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what do we mean by employee retention. So employee retention itself refers to the proportion of employees who stay with an organisation, that are retained by an organisation, typically over a sort of a period of time. So we kind of have two things that we think about when it comes to retention. We look at turnover, which is really the proportion of employees who are leaving the organisation. And then on the other hand, that gives us retention. So what's the proportion of employees that are remaining with the organisation? When it comes to turnover, it's quite helpful to understand what your organisational employee turnover level is. There's a sort of an average turnover figure of around about 15% across most sectors. So that's sort of 15% turnover in staff per year across organisations, but it is much higher in some sectors. So health and social care is notoriously tends to have possibly double that as an average employee turnover figure. But when we think about turnover, typically that means all those employees that leave that organisation. So that might include what we think of as voluntary and involuntary leavers. So voluntary leavers are typically those people who will resign. It's their own personal choice to leave. Whereas involuntary leavers are typically those leavers where it's not the employee's choice. So that may be through perhaps a redundancy programme, perhaps through some kind of disciplinary procedure. So it's helpful when it comes to retention to understand what your voluntary turnover rate is. So what's the level, bear with me, excuse me, what's the level of voluntary turnover that you have within the organisation itself? So those people that are choosing to leave your organisation. Now, obviously, there have been quite some considerable external influences over the last few months, I was going to say, but probably obviously COVID. So COVID had quite, please bear with me.
So we'll just give Alison a chance. As she said, she's just getting over something of an infection. But just to say, if you do have any, there is going to be time for questions and a certain amount of discussion at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions or hints, please do include them in the chat. Back to Alison.
Thank you, Sarah. Huge apologies. So yeah, COVID has obviously had an influence in regards to employment, levels of employment across the UK. Which has had an impact. So there are quite a few external influences. So COVID, obviously we had quite a high rate of turnover during COVID itself, where organisations were having to furlough and then potentially exit staff. Brexit has obviously had a huge impact on the employment market in terms of staff perhaps being leaving organisations, perhaps if they've been EU nationals and they've been looking to perhaps not remain within the UK post-Brexit. Also, obviously, there's been an impact on Brexit in terms of the recruitment market and the availability of candidates within the recruitment market. And then, of course, cost of living. The cost of living sort of crisis that we're having now may be impacting on turnover and retention levels as it comes to people thinking about what level of excuse me, pay or reward they need to maintain a certain standard of living, and whether that's something that might actually influence whether they retain or stay with their current employer. Now, if we could move on to the next slide, please. So we can see that it's helpful to understand what your current level of employee turnover or retention is. And I'll talk you through shortly some ways to measure that. But I wanted to touch on, why do people typically leave a job? And I've put these into two categories, a push category and a pull category. So push tends to be those things that might mean that an employee is going to want to leave their job role. So what kind of things might influence them leaving your organisation? And then the pull is, what are the kinds of things that perhaps a new role or a new organisation might have that might then attract that employee? I think we've just got a poll to do as well. So if we could pop the poll up, Callum, please, and just get people to have a look. So this poll question is just, what do you think is the main reason that people leave a job? And if I can just get you to click one of those, so just pick which you think is the main reason that people leave a job. I'll just give you a couple of moments to click on that. Okay, do we have the poll results on that, please, Callum? Okay, so interesting, we've got lack of opportunity for career progression, 10%, pay 37%, employee benefits package 2, manager 34, workload 17. Nobody that was unsure, which is really, really helpful. So the two highest there are pay and their manager. And I can understand why pay is possibly the highest at the moment, because I think that relates back to this cost of living crisis and the impact that that could be having for people. There is a view with pay that once pay is deemed to be good enough, other factors are more significant in somebody wanting to stay within a job. So there are typically other factors that people find more motivational in wanting to stay with their employer. But obviously that concept of pay being good enough is being challenged at the moment, because pay being good enough is typically that it allows the individual to maintain their sort of current standard of living. So I think there is an issue at the moment where actually pay may be more at the forefront of people's decisions to look for another role than perhaps would be in normal circumstances. But the main reason that people really choose to leave a job is their line manager. You know, that is the number one reason that people choose to leave a role. And I think that comes from a number of things, and some of those that sit under that push heading as well. This issue is sort of, excuse me, fairness, trust, manager capability, I think are all linked together. I think it's really important that line managers have a level of capability in terms of managing people, and quite often people are promoted into management roles and they may not necessarily have had the sort of coaching or perhaps development that they may potentially need. Now, that doesn't need to say that it has to be sort of formal training courses, but one of the most key things is that a manager understands their role, the responsibility that they have, particularly in managing people, but also that they understand the processes and policies that as an organisation you have in play, so that they implement them in a way that is viewed by their team, their reports, as a fair and consistent process. Because if somebody feels that their manager is treating them or others within the team inconsistently or unfairly, then again this creates this issue where this perception of sort of trust between the employee and the employer may start to break down. And those aspects combined can really create an environment where somebody decides that actually they don't believe that they or others are being treated fairly or consistently, so they're going to start to look for another job outside. And that's where some of those pull factors, the attraction of a new role, the pay, the content, the opportunities they're provided or they're talked about there, can form a real pull to then leave. But some of the other things, and the one that you picked up on the poll, was sort of a lack of career opportunities as well. And obviously, you know, people seeing that they want to progress, and that actually the only opportunity to progress may be outside of the workforce that they're in at the moment. If we can just move on quickly to the next slide. The reason that I've put this up is to really, this is a hygiene, a two-factor theory that it's called, that talks about why pay is typically sits within what we call a hygiene factor. So there are through this theory two factors that influence somebody in terms of motivators. So you've got motivator factors, which if they exist, they create a positive attitude and a sense of satisfaction within the job role. And then there are what's referred to as hygiene factors. Now, if you get those right, what tends to happen is you can reduce negative attitudes and dissatisfaction. So them existing, the hygiene factors existing, doesn't necessarily create high levels of satisfaction. But actually, if they don't exist or they're not at the right level, then they can cause dissatisfaction. And these hygiene factors include security, status, pay, supervision, working practice, company policies. So it's all these basics that we'd expect to be in there. You know, things like, you know, having good management capability, having good working conditions, having policies in place, pay at a particular level. They don't necessarily create motivation or satisfaction, but if they don't exist, then they do create dissatisfaction. The motivating factors that can really, again, create a positive attitude and satisfaction include things like growth, advancement, development, recognition, achievement, as well as obviously the impact of the work the individual is doing. So you can see this slight difference between the two, that the hygiene factors can create dissatisfaction if they're not there or they're not there at the right level. But actually, the motivating factors, things like, you know, career progression, growth, advancement, can help create a sort of a positive and a motivating working environment for people. So if we can move on to the next slide, please, Callum. I'm going to move into some of the tips for small charities. And the first thing I think is really about doing a very simple calculation that allows you to calculate the percentage of your employee turnover at the moment. Now, the figure or the calculation that's on screen, which is the total number of leavers over a period. So, for example, if you had 10 leavers over or a 12-month period, times that by 100, divide that by the average total number of people employed over that same period, will give you a percentage figure that is your total turnover. What you can then do is, if you wanted that to just be your voluntary turnover, is you can look at where, rather than the total number of leavers, you could look at the total number of resignations over that period. And that then gives you an indication of what your voluntary turnover percentage is sitting at. And then the question to ask once you know that number is this causing you a problem? So are there problems that are currently being caused by the existing level of voluntary turnover? You know, if you think about, is this causing you a problem, what those problems might be, then obviously it could be things such as the cost associated with having to replace those voluntary leavers, you know, the recruitment time, management time, the costs associated with those. Could be the impact that that's having on service delivery. So understand what the turnover rate is and make some judgment as to whether that's causing you an issue If it is causing you an issue, for example, the cost of recruitment and training of people to get to a particular level, then it could be really helpful to understand why people are leaving the organisation, and perhaps to get some insight into understanding that. Now, again, this would particularly be for those voluntary leavers as opposed to the involuntary leavers, because you'll have an understanding. If it's a redundancy situation, you'll know why that role no longer exists. But exit interviews or exit surveys can be really helpful in getting to understand why people are leaving the organisation. So what's the key driver behind them leaving? They can be done either sort of face-to-face or via surveys. It's typically better that it's not the employee's line manager who undertakes those. So it could be somebody else in the organisation. It could be a survey that they send out. It could be that you get somebody externally to undertake exit interviews on your behalf, but they can be a good source of information as to why people are choosing to leave your organisation. What are those push and pull factors? That will then give you some more information alongside your voluntary turnover figures, with understanding why the turnover levels might be higher, and that may be things that you can then give you some action points that you could look at. It could also be helpful to understand why people stay. You know, you could have conversations with people, you could undertake, again, employee surveys. These don't have to be complex processes, you know, and there are organisations, people like SurveyMonkey, etc., who sometimes have these as a free template that you can use. But as I say, it could be just conversations with your teams or with your staff to understand what are the things that you know, attracted them to your organisation, and what are the things that are keeping them at your organisation, to again just understand why people might be leaving, but also why people might be staying. And that can just give you some useful information about your organisation in terms of understanding if there is an issue with retention levels, and what might be the key drivers behind that, to give you some sort of action plans going forward. So I think we've got another poll at the moment, if I could just ask for that to come up. So just a quick question, do you sort of currently undertake any exit interviews at the moment? So just a quick yes, no, or don't know answer. Don't know if we've got the responses to those yet, Callum. So 90% of you are currently undertaking exit interviews, which is great. So only 10% not, which obviously is very small. So those 10% you might want to consider introducing exit interviews, just to try and get some understanding why people are leaving. Can be really, really helpful information. So that's great to see so many of you doing that. So if we can just move on to the next slide then. So once we've got an understanding, if it is that we're looking at sort of manager capability, then a tool that employers can use to help to increase retention is potentially sort of investing in leadership and people management capability across the organisation. Now, one of the key reasons for an employee leaving, as we talked about, the most important or the top reason people leave a job is typically their manager. May not necessarily be the fault of the manager. So they may not have been given the right skills or the right training, may have been promoted perhaps due to technical rather than people skills. And obviously that can cause an issue itself, where managers may choose to leave if they feel unsupported. But thinking about management capability and considering some kind of training if you're upskilling staff, or even looking at resources that there may be out there to help your people if they're moving into a line management role, or if they're already in a line management role. And in particular, a really, really basic thing that you can do is to make sure that all the managers in your organisation understand, have an awareness of and understand your company policies, so that you can make sure that there's fair and consistent use of those policies. And there are, I've just signposted a bit of resource there, some free resources around managing people and some HR toolkits that we as Roots HR offer. So I think manager capability is really one area that organisations can look at. We can move on to the next slide, please. Then what we're looking at here is really some other factors around motivating, rewarding and recognising performance. And there's different ways that I think that can be done, different things that organisations can look at. Obviously, we talked about basic pay, you know, and there is an issue at the moment in terms of we have lots of organisations coming to us asking us questions around, you know, pay and pay benchmarking at the moment, because organisations are genuinely concerned about their workforce and sort of pay levels. And I think obviously you can look at basic pay, but as I say, what we do need to be mindful of is that once it typically meets needs, other factors do tend to be more of a motivator. But do look at basic pay and consider whether, you know, are you paying at market rates, you know, looking at sort of competition, perhaps undertaking benchmarking and seeing what's affordable then. But really rewarding and recognising and motivating people can be very easily done through good use of performance management. You know, performance management is really down to 3 very simple points or questions that an employee wants answered. They want to know what's expected of them. They're making sure that they clearly understand the expectations of them in their role. They want to know how they're doing, so how are they performing against those expectations? So giving people feedback on their performance, and they want to understand what that means for them. That doesn't necessarily mean financial reward, but that could be actually recognising that performance and what they've achieved. So good performance management that allows for this regular check-in and performance conversations around what's expected of somebody and how they're doing. Another sort of key thing to think of at the moment, which is really important and I think has come to the forefront through COVID, is this sort of, where possible, looking to accommodate individual preferences if they can be in regards to where and when people work. You know, flexibility, changes in how, where, when people worked through COVID has really opened employee and employers' eyes as to what can be done differently and more flexibly in terms of how we work. We expect that sort of flexibility or desire for flexibility to continue. So it could be helpful to look at what you offer and how flexible you can be in terms of where people and how people work. Making sure that you've got company policies and procedures in place. You know, there is this thing about treating people fairly. So, you know, perceived unfairness very likely to lead to sort of resignations. So making sure those company policies and procedures are in place, people understand them, and clearly that managers are aware of those. Well-being, you know, that we're doing these sort of, as well as those performance management check-ins, you know, in terms of what's expected, how am I doing? Also for the manager, checking in on the well-being of staff as well. So looking at, you know, their workload, making sure that, you know, their workload is achievable, looking at what could potentially be done to support mental and physical health within the workplace, you know, and even that, you know, I think we touched on this last week, an employee assistance program, which doesn't have to be cost prohibitive, can be very, very effective in terms of supporting well-being, and also, you know, can help with some of perhaps the current challenges that employees might be facing at the moment, such as financial well-being, but also looking at sort of career development and progression, and seeing what potentially you could enable or maximise opportunities for, you know, for people to develop their skills and their careers within your organisation. You know, even as a very small organisation, there might still be opportunities that you can look at in terms of career progression or professional development that, you know, could be sideways moves or projects or you know, other ways of sort of thinking about developing somebody from a career and a learning and development point of view. So I think there are areas that organisations can look at that are not necessarily high cost, but could potentially give back the sort of the good levels of motivation and support that people are looking for at the moment. So my final slide is just again a check in terms of some resources that are available from us at Roots. You know, there's obviously other sources of support out there as well, but we offer a range of free toolkits, free fact sheets, and obviously they'll be linked to when the links are sent out after today. So that's the end of my part of the session. So thank you, and apologies for the coughing fits in the middle of that. I do apologise.
Alison, thank you so much, and do hope you're feeling 100% really, really soon. As Alison mentioned, she Roots HR CIC is one of our enhanced providers, and providing support to our charity partners. If you're interested in support around HR or other kinds of organisational support through our enhanced programme, and there is a very wide range there available, in terms of discussing your individual support needs, please do contact your regional manager, your respective regional manager, and we'll only be too pleased to have that chat with you. Now we get to pass the baton to I'm very pleased to welcome Niamh Eastwood, who is the Executive Director of one of our charity partners, Release. I will ask, Niamh is going to speak a little bit about their experiences from the perspective of a charity, and will also tell us a little bit about Release's own work. So Niamh, let me pass it over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Alison, thank you so much for that. It was so interesting, and I think really reflects some of the learning that we're doing at our organisation. So I thought maybe it would be helpful for me to tell you a bit about the work we do, where I see the particular challenges that exist within the organisation based on the role of an individual, so very much focused on the service delivery side of things, and then thinking about challenges, opportunities to address retention, and some of the strategies we put in place. We certainly don't have everything right, so I'm really looking forward to learning from everybody else who's here today. But it's been a challenging time, I think, for all of us. I noted Joe's comment in the chat about, you know, retention was very different pre-COVID, and I would agree with that totally. I think the last 2 years have been pretty brutal for everybody, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. But Release is the UK Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drug Laws. We provide legal services and expert drug services to people who use drugs, those who are affected by the drug laws, and also with a particular focus on people who suffer from drug dependency. And so one aspect of the work that we do is service delivery in the community, in drug treatment centres, homeless centres, addressing the legal needs, providing advice, representation around a range of social welfare issues, including homelessness, housing insecurity, financial insecurity, addressing access to benefits and debt issues. We also have a national helpline where we support people around navigating the criminal justice system. We have an advocacy support line which helps people who are in treatment get the treatment that they want. So often we will have people who maybe are on a methadone script who've been told that they need to reduce the dosage that they're on, and that's not something they want to do, but they don't feel they have power in the space to really put forward what they need. So we help with advocates to support them in that process. And through all of those services, I mean, the outreach services are about 1,000 clients a year, and then the helpline's about 3,000 to 4,000 contacts a year. So very much working at the front line with people who often are the most marginalised and disenfranchised groups in society. We also do a lot of policy work. We highlight the ineffectiveness of the current approach to drugs and really focusing on having a public health and a human rights response. So that's some of the work, and I want to go back to the frontline service delivery work, both the advocacy helpline and the outreach work in the community addressing social welfare legal issues. I mean, that work historically is always difficult work, not the clients, they're fabulous. It's really having to work with, third parties, councils, bailiffs, it can be quite grinding work. And I know this myself because I started as a legal advisor at release back in the noughties. So I've done this work. I understand that it can be quite challenging at times, especially when you're dealing with folks who are in crises, and you want to solve that crisis for them, but there's processes you need to do before you can get to that resolution, and that's difficult to manage. So in the best of times, it's hard work, and I think we'll all be in agreement the last couple of years has not been the best of times. And in particular, I think I can only speak for myself, but I think from my perspective, as an individual, there's low level anxiety. I would say that that's something my staff have said to me about, and other colleagues who work in the sector, so other EDs, we've kind of shared that this has been a particularly challenging time for everybody. And the backdrop of that is obviously COVID. We had staff who lost family members very early on at the start of the pandemic. So in the first lockdown, we also lost a colleague to non-COVID related issues in the summer of 2020. So, we're dealing with grief within the organisation, not only our own direct grief, but the indirect grief of colleagues whose family members have died. So I think, again, there is this collective sense of grief. That's not to take away from individual experiences, but it's something that's there and something we're all having to address. And then again, the work in that environment. So, we all had people delivering services in very challenging circumstances. So we would have clients, many of them wouldn't have had external contact with people for days, maybe weeks. And so the legal advisor phones them because, our clients can't afford Zoom and virtual technologies. And so we phone them to support them. And often it's the first conversation they've had in days. And so, they'll want to talk beyond the legal issues. And we recognize the boundaries, but also the need just to be human beings to each other. So, chat about what TV show they've watched or something like that. So our legal advisors and our drug staff team are providing that practical legal support and expert drugs advice, but also kind of doing a broader sort of pastoral approach as well. And at the same time, they themselves are in their own homes, alone, quite isolated. Some of our staff quite young in shared accommodation, which has its own challenges. And I think I would add to Alison's list of things that are contributing to people leaving at the minute, and I think that is emotional burnout. I know for a fact we have at least 2 members of staff who have, one has left the organisation, one is on sabbatical, who feel quite, I suppose the word is just they need space to address their needs, their well-being, their sort of mental and emotional health. And I think that's one of the strategies we've put in place is supporting sabbaticals, supporting people who have offered their resignation to consider other routes like sick leave, like taking unpaid leave, really providing that space for folks to take the time to address the kind of stresses that they've gone through. Also to providing a space within the organisation to acknowledge all this. I think it's really important that we just really say to each other as managers and then to our teams and to allow that conversation to happen. We've had new staff start who haven't been part of that, but there's obviously, they're aware of it. And so providing them the space to be able to talk about what it's like to work in an organisation that's gone through quite a lot over the last couple of years. So I think providing spaces for people to speak in formal settings, obviously like supervision, etc., but also informally. So one of the things we've really done on return to the office is to have a lunch together on a Monday. We all come together and we just chat and we have, we just shoot the breeze and talk about nothing work related, and it's really quite nice. And it's not something we did prior to 2020. And so we have all of that crises of COVID, which is ongoing, but then also as Alison has mentioned, the cost of living crisis. So we've come out of, we're not even out of that crisis, but we're continuing to manage that crisis, and now we've got another crisis on top of us. And again, recognizing all of that. So some of the things that we've really sort of focused on doing is making sure we're consulting with staff around things like return to the office. You know, I know for some organizations that's been a really challenging process. So we've made sure that prior to returning, we consulted with everybody. We made sure everybody was on board. We were very clear that returning to the office was not about the fact we pay rent on a building or that the trustees demanded it, but that we recognized that the isolation was leading to a loss of connection amongst staff members and a loss of an opportunity to learn for new members of staff and younger members of staff, but also an opportunity just to be in a space together. And I think framing it and working with people around that and making sure that they have equal input into it was really helpful. And so what we agreed was 2 days a week in the office. People can come in more if they want to, some do. But 1 day is a full staff day when we spend time together, and we really use that day on a Monday to catch up, to talk about each area of work that we do, how it can intersect, and how we can support each other. One of the other things we've done is around the structure. I think Alison picked up on this, is very much the idea of the work I described as a legal advisor, the work I also did. You know, it's really important that we provide people with the opportunity to expand their skills and their opportunities. And I don't think we have been doing that as well as we could have in the past few years. And so one of the things we're doing is restructuring the organizational framework to make sure that the lawyers are also participating in policy work, that they get to go to Parliament, that they are doing media interviews. We do a lot of that work. So we have the opportunity to expand those roles, to make them more interesting, and to allow people to really feel that they're developing as experts. I think the culture is, again, really important. So, you know, I'm very clear with my colleagues that work's hard enough. Life's hard. Let's not make the office environment hard. Let's make sure that we're trying to create a positive space where people are respectful of each other and kind to each other and respond to each other's emails when they send something. Don't leave people hanging. So we do try to do that. And I think that's a really important thing within the organization. And so just some practical stuff that we've put in place. So sabbaticals, as I mentioned, supporting people to take time away from the office. The employment assistance program we have as well. But we also, we didn't have that at the start of 2020 or in the first 6 months. So we provided access to individual counselling. So we made sure that people's mental health was really supported, especially after my colleague died. We made sure that everybody had access to that. We recognise how traumatic that all is. The pay issue, we have increased pay, and we've actually been quite substantial. We've been quite good at making sure we're meeting the inflationary demands on folks. And so some of the things that we've done are make sure that we've got anywhere between 6% to 10% pay increases, with those at the lower end of the pay scale getting the higher increases from an equitable point of view. What we've done, because obviously we can't, you know, everybody can't afford to do that. But what we did was we went to funders where we were on the last stages of a funding decision before it went to panel, and asked if we could redo our budget to reflect those increases in salary, and all of them have agreed, which is really positive. And I think having those lines of communication with funders is really important. And then, you know, obviously this is Lloyd's and they do great work with the Enhanced programme. But again, the Enhanced programme has been a real boon to the organisation. So we're currently setting up resilience training in recognition of that kind of managing the well-being of the team. And we're also just doing more kind of training as a group that's not specific to the work. So things like public speaking, like anti-racism training. So trying to make sure that we're learning together as an organisation. We haven't got it all right. Our head of policy has just resigned. She's gone back to academia, but that's because we can't pay what universities are paying. So it comes back to the pay again. So that's just some of our experience, but really, really interested to hear from other folks on what their experiences are. Thank you.
Niamh, thank you so much. And thank you for taking us through all of sharing with us both some of the challenges that you've had, but and also your thinking around how to support staff
and both in terms of retaining, but also their development as well. That was really, really good. Thank you so much.